Very nice to see you all this afternoon. Just going to tell you a bit of a story about my father, always known as Sean, but who was christened Arthur Crampton, who was born in 1918. And I'm going to talk a bit about his personal experience and a bit about both London Irish Brigades during the Second World War. And so my father, like many, started in Africa and was part of the Sicily invasion. But before that, he joined the army. He didn't think he wanted to fight. He thought he had very strong moral values, very high values, and he wasn't thinking that he wanted to go to war at the time. So he was thinking of becoming a conscientious objector. He also had tried unsuccessfully to join the Spanish Civil War in Spain on the Republican side. So he was a committed anti-fascist. And what happened was that when he couldn't get to Spain, and I don't quite know the reason, he ended up visiting an aunt in Germany instead. I think his dad didn't want him to go to Spain, wouldn't let him. But he did let him go to Hamburg by train. And his aunt, who was one of our family, had married a German Jew in Hamburg. And at the time my father was visiting, he saw the beginning of the pogroms, he saw the beginning of the Kristallnacht, of that kind of behavior from the Hitler Youth in Hamburg. And his uncle, Herman, was made to walk through the street without trousers or pants on to show that he was circumcised. And a week after my father left, his shop was ransacked. And about 3 weeks later, my aunt and him left for England. And although he spent most of his war in an internment camp, he survived and lived to a good age. So when my dad got back from this visit to Germany, he thought, actually, I'm going to war. I'm going to have some of this. This is not okay. And he recognized in what he'd seen in Germany what was very similar to the English black shirts under Oswald Mosley, who he had already been involved in street fights with in England. So off he went, and he was originally signed up with the Buffs, and then he transferred to the London Irish because they were going more directly into battle, and he felt that in all consciousness that's what he needed to do. He needed to fight the evil that was in front of him. So he was with the East Kent in Egypt for the first part of his war, so in the 8th Army with the Desert Rats. So he was both a desert rat earlier on and then a black cat when he joined the London Irish. So I'll go through these quite quickly. On the right are some of his sketches. My father, I'll speak about this later, but my father's a sculptor and an artist. And the one thing I do have from his war record, except some memories, which I will again tell you, is his sketchbooks. When the transcript of the speech I'm giving today, which won't be anything like the speech I'm giving today, but the kind of background will be there, and that will be available to you. I'll make sure that goes out. But also with it, I'll make sure there's a good handful of the sketches. Okay. So the 1st Battalion London Irish, which is who my dad joined. You can see their journey here, from Kirkuk through Syria up to Alexandria. Next slide. There were the PIA force in northern Iraq and the 8th Army in Egypt. And I think most of you know the history of the 8th Army in Egypt quite well. I won't go into it. Then to Sicily, which I think is probably better known. The invasion of Sicily, which took place in early July 1943. The 2nd Battalion London Irish arrived at Algiers with the 1st Army. Yeah, just keep going. They went into Tunis, at rest in Algeria, and then they came to Sicily about a week later. And that's Eddie's father's regiment. So my father's regiment have arrived in Sicily. Eddie's father's was just a few days behind us. We all came into Syracuse. Okay, so these are the main battles. We'll come back to those. Syracuse to Messina. So they landed in Sicily. I'm sure many of you know these stories, but interestingly, Mark was just talking about Fossa Botticella. Oh no, he wasn't. He was talking about Plymouth Old Bridge. And a couple of the men in those photos received MCs for their action in Sicily. And that my father was with the London Irish Rifles as they fought up the east coast of Sicily, which was where the nasty scraps at Fossa Botticella and Plymouth Old Bridge took place. And for action in that part of the war, my father received a military cross. Could you go to the next one? Keep going. Sorry, I'm going to miss out your dad's battalion a bit. Sorry, Eddie. I know you can add them later. Going on to the... Keep going, yeah. Right. Fossa Botticella, south of Catania, and keep going. Okay, so you can see on the left, that was the citation for my dad's military cross. If I just squeeze it in, just read you a couple of sentences from it. Crampton displayed great gallantry and extremely high powers of leadership and devotion. He led his platoon with great coolness and judgment, although himself stunned at one time by a bullet which hit the front of his helmet and went round the side and out the back, and it grazed his hair, but no further injury. Carried on fighting that night. And for that, and a number of night details where he and his crew his patrol destroyed a number of German armaments, including mines. He skillfully withdrew the patrol. There were a number of patrols, but the last one he withdrew under heavy enemy fire, himself remaining at the last to ensure that his men got away. And he got the military cross for that. And then, with the rest, Mark's grandfather and Eddie's dad, they went up into Italy. My dad came the Salerno route, I believe. Do you want to go on? And they were at Monte Cammino. Now, Monte Cammino, I'm going to describe this in terribly poor logistical terms. But Monte Cammino, I went there last week. It's a really, the German defensive positions were extraordinarily easy. They did, and well maintained. And Monte Cammino was it wasn't a picnic. It was really tough. The 1st Battalion London Irish were largely supporting the Queen's Regiment and the Artillery Regiment, who were obviously trying to take it. There was an extraordinary event where they were going forward. It had reached nightfall. They were exhausted, as you've heard many times. Some of these troops hadn't eaten for days properly and hadn't rested. And they stopped for a break, thinking that the Germans were retreating, and then discovered quite quickly when they advanced the next day that they had not retreated. Actually, what they'd done, we now believe, is reoccupied some of their positions in the night, thinking they were about to meet the onslaught. They didn't, so they reoccupied. So when they tried to move forward again, they were pinned down. And they were there for 7 weeks. And that was shifted after an absolutely massive barrage. And this is a sort of side story to military action, but I think it's important. My father would have wanted me to say it, or would wanted me to talk about it, because during that barrage, that golden shower of rain, of bombs hitting, of artillery going overhead, of strafing, of all of that, he said the most powerful feeling he'd had in his life, that we were not alone. And he was already, of faith of some description, but had been siding more towards the agnostic, I believe. And at this point, he remained for the rest of his life a committed Catholic. And And I just think it's worth mentioning because even in those terribly tribulous times, people found real hope sometimes in their faith. Okay, so as you've been on a few people have spoken about the bridgehead across the Galilee. Thank you. And the amount of troops who didn't make it across the river is terrifying when we think about it now. People being swept down a river and in open fire trying to cross a river and create a bridgehead. They did create a bridgehead. It's just below Castle Forte. And at this bridgehead, there was a very strong recommendation from above, not God, somebody with a few more pips on their shoulder, that what they should do was take Castle Forte. I'm going to talk a bit more about Castle Forte in a minute. I'm going to tell you what happened first to my dad, which is not the whole of Castle Forte's story, of course. But we had a bridgehead on the other side of the Galiano. We were told to take Castle Forte, so many forays were made. And it was very interesting. If you heard Antoine earlier was talking about the same piece of land about 6 months later. This went on. But in those early forays, the London Irish were there, the 1st Battalion were there, and my father, as you've already picked up, was taking patrols out. And although our intelligence believed Castle Forte was untakeable, it was believed that we should keep trying because we'd be able to take it, because that's sometimes what people think you need to do. It's the best way of putting it. In one of those forays, 2 patrols went out. One on the left, which got stranded, and one further into the mountain. My father was part of that patrol. They were checking for mines, cutting wire. The idea still being that there would be assault. This is called Monte Diamano to the British. To the Italians, it's called Monte Scianelli, and it is just to the west of Castle Forte. And if you go there, and some of us have been there, it's rock with some terraces, which are heavily planted, and then it's rock again. And as we've heard, the Germans were well dug in, very hard to shift. Coming round that, at night, they entered a minefield. My father trod on an S mine, a shoe mine, some people call them. Some people call them a jumping jack mine. I hope none of you are too finicky. They're also known as a debolliker. And when you step on one of these mines, it usually takes off most of the bottom half of your body, hence the colloquial term given to it by English and Irish soldiers. My father knew he'd trodden on this mine. He felt it. They have 3 spikes. They look a bit like a stove. And it will have clicked, possibly audibly, or possibly he felt it in his boot. He actually never told me that. And being that I didn't know I'd be stood here talking to you, I didn't ask him. But I tell you what he did do, is he went to his men behind him, get back. He knew what he'd done. So I think, yeah. So, and that's the citation. And so in doing so, he took the full force of the blast. And bluntly, he was expecting to die at that point because of what he'd done, because you're meant to jump off away from it. And it'll still probably take most of you with it, but he didn't. He pushed his weight onto it to save the men behind him, because they jump and then they're shrapnel mines. So, having done this, he was, without hesitation, he shouted to those near him to get down, but keeping his foot pressed on the mine, which went off underneath it, but failed to rise in the air, owing to the force of the explosion being taken by his foot. Lieutenant Crampton's foot was blown off, but by his gallant action, knowing full well what the result of this was likely to be, he undoubtedly saved the lives of those near him. all of whom escaped without injury due to his sacrifice. And as he always said, it was worth it for that bit of tin. He had a sense of humour. And of course, he lived the rest of his life without a foot, but without part of his leg. But what we managed to do this year was memorialise Castelforte, I suppose, the museum that's there, the contribution that troops of many different races and battalions gave, both in defending it for the Germans and in taking it for the Allies. And we memorialised it on the night, on the hour that Castelforte was 6 months later-ish, the 11th of May. My dad lost his leg on the 19th of January, so somebody who's better at maths can work that out. We have opened, there's a museum in Castelforte, and it's called the Gustav Line Museum. It's run by some exceptional volunteers who work really hard to keep that memorial going. And they've opened a little exhibition to my dad, but I'm going to tell you two little stories about how that happened. Was about 4 years ago, I went to see when my dad lost his leg. I wasn't really in touch with Eddie or Richard, his brother, at the time. Wasn't really in touch with my dad's association. I was emailing somebody who wasn't around, and kept trying, but I had no idea I was going nowhere. Anyway, and I'm stood in Castelforte, pointing at the hill, saying, I think my dad lost his leg up there. And a couple of Italians who spoke no English said, what are you looking for? Can we help you? And I said, oh, well, the museum's closed, but my father fought here in my very bad Italian, and he lost his leg there. And the man who'd asked me what I wanted was the president of the museum. And all of the events I've just spoken about, we had a huge memorialisation in Castelforte, came about because I bumped into him on the street. And that's how these things happen. And this year, which is the first time Castelforte has ever had a proper event about the people who fought for it and its liberation, I was staying in a B&B nearby, and we'd just been for a swim, and we were waiting for Eddie and Rich and some of the other London Irish people to turn up. I was with the Pipers. And I'm stood on my balcony bit with a towel round me, nothing else. And a car pulls up with two gentlemen in it, about my age. I know it's not Eddie or Rich or any of the people I know. I didn't know these people, but I realised they were probably with us. And I said, hey, are you here for the London Irish commemorations? They said, absolutely. They told me their names. I told them my name. They said, so, you're Captain Crampton's son, that'll be the man who saved our dad's life. Their father was in that patrol. He was behind my dad. And David Sweeney did this extraordinary thing. I'm stood on the balcony talking to him, and he went, and your dad went like that. And every time my dad spoke to me about that action, why he got that bit of tin, he went, I went like that. And it was the same, absolutely, body movement. It was extraordinary. Anyway, that's just a little personal bit. But we were able to do the memorial with them speaking with me, with us telling that story. And, from that, we were able to properly celebrate that for the first time ever in Castelforte. Okay. So then we went on to Monte Cassino and we had an extraordinary time. Also in Castelforte, we did an amazing battlefield tour where the Pipers just played their hearts out on the top of the mountain where all this action took place. It was absolutely lovely. And hopefully we can put all of that onto the website for people to see, because I can't make a noise like a piper without doing myself really bad damage. Just doesn't happen. So We went on to Casino. We continued the memorialisation, and it was fantastic. We had a London Irish representation all the way through, pipers at the German commemorations, as Michaela's rightly recorded, pipers with the New Zealanders. We had a really, really good series of days there. The battalion my father fought for, the two gentlemen I'm talking about, their dad was an officer in that, a non-commissioned officer. My dad was an officer in that battalion. Their father, the Sweeney's father, was the only officer who made it through the war. So there's a lot of extraordinary events in one place. But Dad obviously left at that time, and his battalion, as I've just made you aware to a degree, carried on up through Anzio and then eventually up through Italy, but having to join other battalions as they fragmented and as men were lost. And by the end, there weren't many of them left, to be honest. But and the 2nd Battalion continued as well. Both battalions were back up again around the Po and Bologna. But my father, to finish his story, if that's okay, is he went on to, he was an artist. He knew he was going to be an artist. He did silversmithing before. When he came back from the war, he started to sculpt more and more and developed, started welding phosphor bronze, which basically no one had done before. He did hundreds of ecclesiastical sculptures, including some Stations of the Cross, which were done of the Italian campaign. The people in it were dressed as, you know, they were soldiers. I mean, they were figurative, but they were soldiers. And his epitaph when he died in 1999, and his epitaph in, I think the Times, was an artist forged by war. So he went on to have a successful career as a sculptor, quite a few wives and quite a few children. Interesting for a Catholic, but hey, you've got to have a hobby. So I think that's it for today. It's been really good. Thank you very much for listening to me. Tutte bene. Thank you.